Welcome to Disruptive Successor, a show for next generation leaders in family businesses and entrepreneurs who want to disrupt the status quo and take their existing business to a whole new level. We all know that what got us here isn't going to get us there. This show will provide inspiration, advice, and resources to help you create massive impact. Hi, it's Jonathan Goldhill, and welcome back to another episode of the Disruptive Successor Show. And this is a show, by the way, for family businesses who are interested in building sustainable competitive advantage through their family business. And as you know, I bring on experts who work with family businesses, and I have someone today who has built a global organization working with multi-generational family businesses. Josh Barron is a partner and co-founder of BanyanGlobal, which is an advisory firm that works with leading family enterprises around the world. He also teaches family business courses at Colombia Business School and is the co-author of a forthcoming Harvard Business Review Family Business Handbook. So Josh is an expert in how family businesses can last for generations. He's also an expert in how to manage conflict in a family enterprise and teaches a course on that at Columbia, and how family businesses can sustain competitive advantages. And that's what we're going to do a deep dive in, is these three issues. So Josh, welcome to my show.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
So let's just start with a little background and bio on you. You started BanyanGlobal, and you've been in this space for how long? Tell us a little bit about the origination of BanyanGlobal and the types of clients you work with.
Absolutely. So I've been doing this work with family enterprises for almost 15 years. Like many things in life, I found this work by accident. I didn't know that this was something that people did for a living. My career has been as a strategy consultant. I worked for Bain & Company, and then a spinoff of Bain called Bridgespan that works with large foundations and nonprofit organizations. And then I just got introduced to this field, and I joined a firm that came out of the Harvard Business School kind of program on family businesses, which is a really great one, really one of the origins of the field. And then almost 9 years ago, my colleagues and I left that and created Banyan, and we were really focused on trying to build up a firm. Most of my colleagues come from professional firms like Bain or BCG, or law firms, accounting firms. And we really set off to build a multi-generational firm that would advise multi-generational family businesses. And that's what we've done. We're now up to about 30 people full-time, which is small compared to the Bains of the world, but we're actually the largest family business advisory firm that we know of. And we work with families all over the world. A lot of our clients have significant operating companies. Some have family offices or family foundations, shared property, some all of the above. We really work at this intersection between family decision-making and things that have value, financial value, emotional value, all the rest of it. And it's the most rewarding work of my life. I actually can't imagine doing anything else.
Amazing. So now I have studied family business for a while. I've been in this space for quite a while. And one thing that really surprised me was when my book came out, how many copies were sold or downloaded in India. Yeah. And what I learned was that, it's not widely known yet still, but that 2/3 of all businesses in the United States are family owned. And that percentage may be, it's very debatable. Maybe it's 75, maybe it's higher. But sure. in India, they're talking about it being like 95% or even higher. So what are your observations just from working globally around family businesses in different countries and the makeup, and where are you seeing a lot of your work these days?
Yes, it's a great question, and I think the statistics you cited are similar to the ones that I've seen, and family businesses are really the unknown backbone of the American economy, and as you said, globally, even a higher percentage in many of these countries where they don't have as many public companies and other things like that. Family businesses are the primary form, even of the very largest companies in the world. So, and I've been really fortunate. I've done a lot of work, obviously in the U.S. and Canada, but also in Latin America, a lot in Southeast Asia as well. And what I guess the first thing I would say is that the differences are less than the similarities. If you're working with a family, a group of siblings or cousins or whatever, in Chile, Argentina, or in the Philippines or Indonesia, in the U.S., the issues and dynamics are very similar. You can recognize them pretty easily. And so there's a lot more, I would say 80% of the things are pretty similar. There are some really important differences that come up, sometimes around cultural dimensions. I think those tend to be overstated a bit because every family has its own culture, which is partly shaped by the culture of the country of origin, but is also, especially global families, people are coming in, they're learning, they're studying elsewhere. So the culture really takes on a life of its own. The legal traditions and laws are a big shaper of how things are different. So for example, if you're in a country like the US, which has a significant estate tax, that drives a ton of decision-making in larger family businesses. You put things in trust, and all these mechanisms that have been created to try to keep a business going. Rules are very different in Germany, where you can pass down an operating business differently than a pool of assets. Brazil, you're required actually to, all of your descendants are going to be heirs, whereas in the U.S. and other countries you can choose. We work in the Middle East, where there's Sharia law to kind of manage with also again specifies who gets what. So a lot of the differences actually are of how family businesses work and evolve over time are really determined by that legal context and about how ownership varies in these different environments.
Fascinating. And yet at the same time, they have some of the same dimensions that regular businesses have. And I think you and I've talked about the work that Pat Lencioni has done, specifically his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which has been so widely used by consultants working with leadership teams, that conflict, communication, commitment, these 5 pillars of his dysfunctions, they show up in any business, don't they? And I mean, are they any different in family businesses?
I think, yes, they show up in all businesses, and I've had an opportunity to work in all kinds of different kinds of businesses and organizations over my career. But there is something different about family businesses, and one of the differences is that when you have an argument or conflict or lack of conflict at work, for the most part, you don't bring it home with you. There's a boundary between your work life and your personal life. And in a family business, unless you create those boundaries, which is something that's a good practice as part of managing conflict, they don't exist on their own. I've seen, for example, where someone didn't get invited to a wedding or another family event that spills over into the business side. And likewise, you have these business disagreements that spill over onto the family side. And actually, they create this sort of feedback loop, and they accelerating each other. So one of the words we use in family businesses is it's a system, meaning that there are interconnected parts that affect each other in different ways. And because these things are interconnected, when an action in one place has an impact in another, and sometimes in a way that's unintended, undesired, unhelpful. So yeah, I mean, these dynamics it's not that other businesses don't have some of these same challenges, but I think they're amplified, they're magnified. They're a little different in a family business than in other kinds of companies.
Okay, so let me get down to some really basic questions here.
Sure.
In your company, when you're consulting with a family business, do you talk to them about these decisions about inviting the family members to a wedding or a ceremonial occasion? Do you have these kind of personal conversations about the impact of decisions going on in the family, how that's going to impact the business?
I mean, yes, in the sense that like everything is interconnected. I mean, I think there's a difference between the work that we do is more advisory and less, trying to do, therapy, which therapy can be really helpful and beneficial in families. It's just not what we do. And obviously there's not necessarily a hard and fast, bright line between the two. But a lot of our work is actually trying to help families to make decisions and get things done together. And one of the things that we found a really helpful way of understanding the world of a family business is what we call the four rooms, which is basically different parts of a family business. Just like in your house, you have a different conversation, you do different work in the kitchen than the living room, make different decisions. In a family business, you have these different kinds of things, and you sort of help to you need to make sure that you've got them set up to sort of do that work effectively to make those decisions well. And the four rooms are the management room, which is where you run the business day to day. You make lots of operational decisions. You've got the boardroom, which is where you make strategic decisions. You find managers, you think about succession planning. You've got the owner room, which is where you make a relatively small number of big decisions about should we keep our company private? Should we go public? Are there certain things we won't do, even if they might make us more money? And then you have the family room, which is where you develop the next generation. You work on family unity. You organize family events and retreats. You manage family assets like a vacation home or a foundation or things like that. And so one of the things that we found really helpful is to clarify what are the what's happening in each of those rooms. How are you making all those decisions? Who needs to be involved? And sometimes it's the same people. I worked with one family in Southeast Asia where there were a group of siblings that had lunch every day, and they would sort of toggle between very detailed tactical operational business decisions to how much we're going to pay in dividends to where we're going on family vacation. And even though it was the same group making the core decisions, it was really helpful to pull those apart and say, okay, now we're in the management room, right? And by the way, when we're in the management room, we should probably invite in our other managers, right? When we're in the family room, we should invite in the spouses and the next generation to be part of that conversation. So I think one of the things that's really helpful is trying to create those boundaries, creating that clarity about how different decisions will be made.
So let's talk about what conversations are appropriate for which rooms. And I wish I had a few more examples, but the first one that comes to mind is you're thinking about putting in a profit sharing plan and you haven't had one before. Or you want to discuss, an ESOP, an employee stock ownership program.
Sure.
What room would those conversations be most appropriate for?
Well, and here's the magic, because in part of the work of governance, which is what the four rooms is all about, is structure. Like say, okay, we need a board of directors, we need a senior leadership team, we need a family council or an owner council. But then a lot of the work is just like your house has, hallways and doors and so on. You have to figure out the flow, like how to actually, especially decisions that cut across these different rooms, how do you make them? And so a lot of the work we do with families is saying, let's take a big decision and let's figure out where it goes. And so let's take your example of a profit sharing plan. That's one that actually would cut across at least the management board and owner rooms, right? Because the management team is going to have a role in sort of giving feedback about what type of plan would motivate them, giving their perspective, putting some thoughts around the parameters that might make sense. The board's job is in general to provide oversight on compensation for senior managers, and oftentimes the actual design of that plan would be done, with the board, in the boardroom. But then the owners have a role also to say, well, incentivized to what, right? I mean, are we focusing on trying to grow earnings? Are we trying to build this business and sell it over the next 5 years? Are we focusing on long-term investment? Do we care more about return on invested capital? We want to make sure there's some parameters in there about not taking on too much risk or debt. So there's a role that, across a big decision like that one, where you're going to have different perspectives and really figuring out how do you set that decision up to be successful.
I think that's a great challenge, especially I think my clients are mostly representative of the Southeast Asian client you were referring to, where it's the same family members and they're
absolutely,
and it's difficult to discern what should we talk about in with which group of people. And so it takes a lot of thoughtfulness. And,
absolutely.
And I imagine conflict comes into play in some of these situations as well. So let's get into conflict. I know you teach a course at Colombia in conflict. Let's start with what is the curriculum or structural overview of the course, or what's the framework And what frameworks are things that business owners should be thinking about when they think about conflict? Because I wrote about it in
Sure.
my book in a little way, but especially like I broke it down into decision making. I said, okay, let's determine what types of decisions these are. Are these, and I broke it down into like 5 different types, but basically, are they strategic? Are they tactical? Do
Sure.
we, and then what type of meeting does this framework, does this fit into our standard, weekly meeting? Is this an ad hoc? So talk about conflict and your frameworks and, your perspective on it.
Sure. I'll just, I guess I'll hit a few of the highlights from the class, I guess a semester in just a couple minutes. One is just realizing that conflict is inevitable in a family business. Like it's sort of whenever you have more than one, person, more than one interest set, you can't actually expect that everyone's going to get along all the time. And that actually leads to what I'd say the second point, which is one of the things we talk about a lot in class and with my clients is that conflict is a Goldilocks problem in the sense that either too much of it or too little of it are a challenge. And actually, if you sort of I actually have the students do this in class, we go through a list of how does too much conflict affect the business? How does that affect the family? How does too little conflict affect the business and the family? And what the students discover, is that the effects are almost identical. That too little conflict and too much and too little conflict both affect the quality of decision making, the competitive advantage of the business, the ability to sustain it, and they affect the quality of family relationships. Different mechanisms, but same results. And so what we talk about is that it's finding that space in the middle of not too much or too little. And if you read the press or if you watch TV shows like Succession or Dynasty and Dallas before it, you have this impression that family businesses are all about conflict. This is nonstop. People are fighting each other. They're these backstabbing, these really sort of dramatic events. Those happen, but in my experience, the vast majority of family businesses are actually on the other side of the spectrum, where they're conditioned not to have conflict. They're conditioned to sweep things under the rugs, under the rug, and they have this sort of feeling of harmony, but it's a fake harmony because it's not. There are issues that are just not being discussed and talked about, and over time, of course, those issues build up, and either people end up exploding with each other, or they just pull back from the family business, and either way, it starts to fall apart. So the big challenge of a family business is how do you find that spot in the middle? And what we talk about in class is basically different strategies. There's 5 that I kind of work on. We work through it in class of ways of trying to manage conflict, of trying to keep it in bounds when either it's gotten out of control when the temperature is too hot, or more often when the temperature is too cold. You have to raise the thermostat a little bit. How do you do that in a safe way? And so we kind of just talk about how over time, families have used some combination of these different strategies. They've done something. If they hadn't found some way of keeping conflict under, in a reasonable rate, the business would never have had the success that it's had. But over time, whatever strategies have been put in place no longer work. Like, for example, you've got a single authority figure, the founder, right, who makes all the decisions for everyone, which works well until that person's no longer there. And then what? And what we talk about is that when those things disappear, if you don't replace them with some other ways of keeping conflict under wraps, that's when things start to spiral out of control. So those are some of the kind of the key themes that we talk about in class.
Yeah. Do you find that having a framework so that you have the 4 rooms, so that becomes now a conversational framework for where do you
Sure.
have certain conversations?
Yes.
So is there a conflict framework, and is it embodied in your new book, Family Business Handbook? Because frameworks, I think, are really helpful to people. It puts everything in buckets or boxes and puts a nice little bow around it, and then people can refer to that's that box conversation. So
Sure.
tell me a little bit about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, so there definitely are frameworks that I use in class, that I think our students find quite helpful, and with clients that are in a high conflict situation as well. There's some of that in the book. There's actually a chapter on managing conflict in the family business that'll go into some of this stuff. But the book is not really focused on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really focused more on this issue of longevity. How do you keep a family business going across time? And of course, one of the things you have to do is to try to manage conflict, but it's not the centerpiece of it. In the book, my colleague Rob and I, my co-author, are really looking at how do you how do you make the kinds of choices that really help a business to sustain across generations?
Okay, let's segue into that. So
Sure.
I mean, I imagine it differs by culture. You said earlier about the different, I didn't know that in Brazil, like everyone who's a descendant is deserved, owner of that business. But that
Sure.
kind of succession is certainly carved out here in the United States very differently. Um,
Sure.
so yeah, how do we sustain business through the generations? What are some of the tenets of that?
Yeah. So the core idea of the book, and really this comes straight from our practice of working with dozens of family businesses around the world, is that the key to success lies in a word, in a concept that we believe is very much underexplored in the business world, which is the idea of ownership. And I teach at a business school. I think most business schools spend, Columbia accepted, spend very little time talking about ownership. You talk about management. You talk about corporate governance. There's not a lot of talk about ownership. And the reason is because the way that we look at the world in the business world, either in business school, business books, for the most part, is through the lens of the public company, where owners don't frankly do very much. Maybe trading shares on apps, or maybe part of a mutual fund. They maybe sign a proxy statement. If they do that, I don't always even bother with the companies that I'm invested in.
Mhm.
You occasionally have these activist kind of pushes, but in general, ownership doesn't mean much when you're an owner of a public company.
Sure.
And so the power that comes through. I mean, think about what ownership means. If you own a house, right, which I know you do,
Hmm.
think about all the power you have about what happens inside that house. Who can come inside of it, who gets to own it next after you, how it's laid out, the color scheme on the walls, like everything of importance as an owner, you get to decide. And in a public company, that power is muted. It's already been delegated to management. Management's off and running with it. In a family business, it could not be more different. The power of ownership that comes with the power of ownership is actually vested in a relatively small number of people. Even if it's a couple hundred, it's still, can get into a room,
Hmm.
together, back in the pre-COVID days, at least. And they care about the company. They're actually invested, not just literally, but figuratively in that company. And so our work, at the core of the book is really about how is it that you exercise this power of ownership. And what we talk about is there are these 5 rights that you have as an owner. You have the right to design it, to architect it, to say who can be an owner, who cannot. And of course, you have your rules like Brazil or the US, but even within that, you have some choices. You have the right to decide, to sort of say, okay, how are we going to make decisions? The owners can literally make every decision they want, but you don't necessarily want it. You want to delegate appropriately. That's the work of governance we were just talking about with the 4 rooms. You have the right to value. You have the right to say, how are we going to define success? Is it all about increasing shareholder returns, or is it something else? Is it more than that? And the owners get to decide that. You have the right to information. You have the right to decide who gets to know what, and you can, you have within the business, with the family, with the public, and you can use that communication to build trusted relationships, or you can kind of keep things more insular. And then lastly, you have the right to transfer. If you own something, you have the right to say who gets it next. And so you control the succession planning process of one generation to the next. And so if you add those 5 things together, what you get is the ability to influence effectively everything of importance about what's happening in that family business. And that's the power of ownership. That's the work that family businesses have to do in order to have their business last from generation to generation.
Interesting. And just as a side note, to digress for a sec, there's
Sure.
some data, you probably have it at your fingertips, about the percentage of publicly traded companies in the United States that are still family owned and controlled. And
Yeah.
it's a staggeringly high figure, higher than people would ever think. I don't know if you know what that number is, but
It's between 30-40%. It partly
yeah,
depends on what we're considering. Like some of them are founder led versus family, but it's a lot. Yeah, I mean,
right.
if you sort of broaden it to say what percent of public companies have concentrated control, meaning whether it's a family or an individual,
Hmm.
even things like Google, or Berkshire Hathaway.
Hmm.
They're public companies, but the control over them is exercised by a relatively small number of people. Or you take Molson Coors, which is
Hmm.
two families now that own that brewery. It's publicly traded, but they control the shares. Walmart,
Right.
these companies
Yep.
are enormous, and they have they at their core they have a person, whether it's like Amazon or a small group of people that are exercising the control over those enterprises.
And so they still have an influence in these 5 areas that you're talking about to some
Yeah,
degree. I mean, but
absolutely. Yeah.
it's
So some of the work that I'm really interested in how ownership structure affects competitive advantage. It's one of the things that,
mhm.
actually my next project is going to be about that. And in that work that I do, I kind of talk about these sort of three main types of companies. You have the public, businesses that are, where the shares are widely distributed. No one really owns it per se. I mean, it's not owned by a particular person. It's owned by a bunch of investors, right? Then you have the private businesses that are owned by, there's an exclusive group, whether it's a family business or a partnership like my company, or
Mhm.
larger ones like PwC and so on. And
Mhm.
then you have these hybrids, which are in the middle, and that have aspects of both, where you have like the Berkshire Hathaway, which Warren Buffett describes as a publicly traded partnership, because he and Charlie Munger control the voting shares, and so they control the board, but it's publicly traded. It has aspects of being both a public company as well as a private company. It has sort of different pieces of that. You see lots of these hybrids all over the world, that are kind of a very interesting structure to look at.
Interesting. So a lot of the work that I've done as a coach when I first started coaching businesses was around what I call ownership thinking.
Yeah,
And it's around just developing a mindset that first, your business is a distinct asset separate from
sure.
you. So don't make yourself the business. So that was
Yep,
part of that thinking. The other
yep,
part of that thinking was so how do you create like an entrepreneurial spirit culture within your organization so that others feel that sense of ownership? And the easiest and most obvious thing is, well, let's put a profit sharing plan in. Let's put something, vesting schedule that,
yeah,
or phantom stock, or some
yeah,
sort of deferred program. But it's about creating a culture where people really own what the business is. They own the values, they live the purpose,
yes,
and that kind of thinking and mindset is very profound. And
yeah,
that goes along with the Gallup Q12 employee engagement, where the higher scores absolutely show higher earnings per share for public companies, and certainly the private companies that I've worked with, they make a lot more money. I mean, like profit money.
100%. Yeah, and I think part of the challenge is that we've simplified the idea of ownership to the physical act of owning shares.
Hmm.
And I think all of the challenges that we're seeing with public companies and corporate executive pay and all those things are showing that simply providing an ownership incentive doesn't actually make people behave like owners, especially if you want them to behave as long-term owners, which is very different than a short-term. When you buy a car, you treat it very differently than when you rent a car, right?
Hmm.
And corporate
Yep.
CEOs are renters. They're not buyers
Right.
in public companies. But and interestingly, I'm sort of really interested in the research on ESOPs and employee-owned companies, and what it shows is that just doing an ESOP doesn't actually change the game very much. Just having employees be owners does not itself create the kind of what you're talking about, that engagement, that enthusiasm, that connection.
Yep.
Um, what it does, though, is if employees are owners and you want them to be bought in, to understand it, you have to educate them. You have to open the books. You have to sort of help them to understand what ownership means, and that's what creates those behaviors, right? And so on the flip side, especially if you're a family business, you don't want to share ownership. And most of the family business I work with do not. Some have employee owners and so on, but most don't. The flip side of that is that you actually don't have to give someone ownership in order to have them treat the company as if they're an owner. A lot of it comes down to the culture that you create, the connection that you create to the business, that sort of the values, as you said, that get passed down through families. our values come from our family. So the family is carrier of that from generation to generation. If you're able to infuse that sort of into your business's DNA, you can get a lot of the, I see this all the time, you get a lot of the benefits of engagement without actually sharing ownership, without the plans. And of course you can do that on top, and it's a great idea. You want your executives and your team to be aligned and have incentives and all that kind of stuff. But that's not where the magic comes from. The magic comes from building that culture. And I think family businesses have the potential to do that in really powerful ways.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that the potential to make a family out of the people who work for your company is as impactful as actually having bloodline family. And that's why Jack Stack, The Great Game of Business, Springfield Remanufacturing Company, why they created that whole program for that ownership thinking, which is, and how do we get people understanding the financial results of this company and buy into it?
100%.
And so very, very profound, very powerful. So
and that if folks who haven't read, I think that's one of the most innovative work being done, on this in the sort of the management field that doesn't probably get as much attention as it should, which is the Great Game of Business. This whole open book management, and this is something actually that family businesses struggle with, and sometimes because there's a desire to kind of be private. They don't want actually anyone to know how much money they're making. But sometimes you can communicate a lot of valuable information without sharing the bottom line and getting people involved and engaged and excited about what's happening. And so even if you're careful about what you share and why, which I understand many are, don't just sort of think that you're missing out on an opportunity to really engage employees if you're not inviting them into at least some of the conversations that are happening inside the business.
Well, I think also, as I recall from reading The Great Game of Business, the book, which I highly recommend to people if they're not familiar with the book, pick up a copy so you can learn a little bit about the thinking behind open book management. But the average worker, laborer, let's say, in a business thinks that the gross profit is probably like the net profit. They don't understand that there's a whole lot of expenses. And yes, they probably have their own household expenses and they could maybe relate to it, but like insurance and compliance stuff and legal and bookkeeping, and we could go on and on. There are so many sort of below the middle line or gross profit line that they don't know anything about. So they might think that you're making 50% of whatever you're selling something for, because that's all they see is that part of the cost. So, you may be doing yourself a disservice by not sharing some of that. And you don't have to get to the bottom line. You can just explain, help them understand the cost of materials and labor that just went into it. And then they have all these other things that. So, and then
absolutely,
of course, if they want to, and they're always welcome to take risk if they want to go out on their own and put their own capital at play. So the power of family businesses, the ability to make it last through generations. Is there any data to suggest that it's changing over time, that family businesses are staying more intact, or any data at all that you've seen around the pandemic and what it's doing to? I think it's just an equal opportunity levelizer, but I don't know that it's doing anything to family businesses per se. But have you done any research in that area?
So it's actually the problem. There's some really good research on publicly traded family businesses compared to others. One of my colleagues and some of his colleagues at BCG did some great work showing how family businesses, publicly traded ones, outperform non-family publicly traded businesses across the business cycle. I think the case there is pretty compelling. I think on the public company side, one of the things we are seeing is that exit rates are going up, like the failure rates are happening, the competition is greater, those kinds of things. The problem is there's not a lot of research. It's hard to do research on private companies because they are private by definition. So it's actually really challenging to get longevity data. Most of the stats that people talk about actually go back to a study that was done in the 80s about Illinois manufacturing companies. And anytime you hear like 30% of family business make it through the second generation and 10%, whatever, like that all goes back to a single which is a carefully done analysis, but
it was a small data set though.
It's a small data set. Anyway, so I think we can, certainly, if you look around the world, most of the longest lasting businesses are family businesses, and I don't think that's an accident. They're built for resilience more than they're built for taking advantage of these incredible growth moments that happen for the Amazons and so on. But most of the business world is not Amazon or Apple. And works differently. And I think that's where family businesses actually have an advantage. And actually, we're seeing that through the pandemic. We did a survey of family businesses back in the late spring, early summer timeframe, and what we found was that there's a chunk that were about 5% or so that were sort of experiencing some more of an existential crisis, but most weren't. They were kind of split evenly between those that were having a hard time and those that were managing pretty well through it. Most of them seem, I think there's clearly going to be some casualties of this time, but I think that family businesses will actually, the ones that I work with are seeing this as an opportunity, an opportunity to really reflect on what makes our business, what's core versus what are some things that we've been doing that we ought to change. We're seeing some acceleration of things into the digital world, for example, that were maybe a hard sell before. We're seeing a lot of investments into those kinds of getting your company into that world. So the ones that I'm talking to are, for the most part, seeing this as a time of reinvention. They're less leveraged for the most part, on average, than other kinds of companies, and so they were less at risk of going out of business. They're more stronger cash positions. When there's an opportunity for purchases to happen, I think we should expect that family businesses are going to be doing just fine. So I think if anything, the pandemic really to me reinforced the value of thinking about business through this long-term lens. And that doesn't mean that some family businesses won't be unfortunate casualties, but I think overall the sector will emerge at least as strong as before.
Well, it's really interesting to think about, where you're located, the perspective you could have about businesses. Because I know you're in Cambridge, Mass. I'm just north of Santa Monica. If you live in those places, or Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area, you probably think that every business that's really starting, growing, that you hear about in the news is all digital, it's all tech, and those are largely, I don't think of them as family businesses by and large. Most of the family businesses I think of are in what I call unsexy industries. They're home builders, they're contractors, they're real estate, property management. So boy, it sure will be interesting to see if technology businesses become family businesses and lasted to multi-generation.
That's the big question. I mean, you saw it with Hewlett Packard. I mean, they actually, the family made the decision when they were passing it down the generations. They gave away a fair amount of the shares, very generously. I mean, the Hewlett and Packard Foundations are two of the most significant grant makers in the country. But because of that, they actually gave up control, and this became a real issue when Carly Fiorina tried to do the Compaq acquisition. The second gen tried to push back. They tried to stop it, but they lost a proxy battle. I think it was 51-49 or something like that. They'd given up just enough control. And what's going to be really interesting, at least to me, is some of these businesses are really associated with the people that are their founders, like the Googles and Zuckerberg with Facebook. They're still so young. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with those control shares, which they have. Yep. Are they going to pass those down and turn these into these sort of hybrid family public companies? Are they going to liquidate them over time? It's going to be fascinating to see what happens. And obviously, there's a few $1 trillion at stake in those decisions.
Very interesting. Josh, great conversation. Tell us just quickly about the Family Business Handbook. I know it's due out in January, which is about when this podcast is going to be released. Tell us, where do people find it? A little bit of, is it a Harvard Business Review official publication? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Harvard Business Review, has these books, that they've created it's part of a handbook series, which are kind of the everything you need to know about a topic. And of course, it's not everything you need to know, but it's designed to be a very practical, guide to working through these issues. They've got one on leadership, on management, and entrepreneurship. And so this is the Family Business Handbook. It's sort of a very practical way of working through these issues, but it also has what we believe are some big ideas embedded in it about this power of ownership and how you can use ownership to help your business sustain across time. It's out in January. You can order it, Amazon, everywhere else that you order your books, and hopefully people find it to be a useful resource. It's Harvard's first family business book in about I think 15 years. So an overdue contribution, and it really is really based upon the work that my colleagues and I have been doing with some leading family businesses around the world. So we're excited to share it. Look forward to people having a chance to read it and giving us some feedback about what they're finding.
Great. And is it a family business book for smarties as opposed to a family business book for dummies, or is it cover everyone? Is it good reading for any skill reading business size level?
I think anyone who's got a level of curiosity and an interest in the subject, whether you're an owner or an in-law or an executive or in the M&A business, acquiring family business, I think you'll find things of value for you in it. And it's written in a way that it has both hopefully some insightful frameworks and approaches and tools, but hopefully is written in a way that's accessible to everyone that's interested.
Gotcha. Great. Josh, thank you very much for being on my show. And I'll close it out. Folks, if you like this, please share it with others. This is a show by, for, and about family businesses. We have obviously one of the leading world experts, a guy right out of the Harvard area with a book. So check it out, download it, watch it, read it, however you can consume that. So Josh, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on the Disruptive Successor Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, review, and share with a friend who would benefit from the message. If you're interested in picking up a copy of my book, Disruptive Successor, go to disruptivesuccessor.com.